Steven and I, and Dave Fridman, I mean, we all are aware that if we keep messing with something, you know, it is gonna sound like the Flaming Lips. And, you know, we're slightly whimsical, we're slightly serious, and we're slightly positive. And all those things together keep working their good or bad, however you perceive that.
You know, sometimes you're just messing around. You don't really, I guess sometimes you start on an idea and you're thinking, oh, this could be this song for whatever, but sometimes you're just, you know, really just entertaining yourself. You know, that's really all it was.
When you use the term psychedelic rock, most people may think of the 1960s and onward, generally perceived as the hippie years. They may think of songs like In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida and Riders on the Storm, places like Woodstock, or bands like Pink Floyd, arguably, and the Beatles in their later years. The genre itself is colorful, diverse, almost always experimental, and of course drugs are involved. Lots and lots of drugs. But there's nothing wrong with any of that. Unless your drugs are like meth, heroin, and other shit along the same vein. No pun intended. But anyways, today when you mention the term psychedelic rock, or just psychedelic music in general, there's a good chance that somebody who is a fan of the genres will eventually lead you to a band like the Flaming Lips. That's assuming there even exists a band that reaches their level musically. This is a band.
This is a band
that is not only a shining example of experimentation, adaptation, and expansion in the psychedelic music sphere, but they are also an example of some of the values of being very flexible in the music world. This is a band whose sound, even as decades, that's right, decades past, is still exploring new areas for themselves, forming new techniques and mindsets, and experimenting not just in their music, all while forcing themselves outside of their own comfort zone and forming one of the most eclectic discographies you might see thus far in a band's history since Nickelback. One of the most peculiar things about the Flaming Lips is that although they're all over the place both in their music and where their music appears, the average person doesn't know the band, at least by name. They've been involved in numerous film soundtracks, collaborated with many other musicians and bands on their records, and have produced some of the strangest stuff to date that critics and fans alike still talk about today. Yet it's like you gotta dig somewhat deep to find people who actually know about this band and their material. It's like they're mainstream, yet also underground, kind of like some trap musicians, or Ghost, or Cover Killer Nation. So to put it simply, you may have heard this band, but you may not know who the band is. As usual in most retrospectives, I'm not going to include much more than just the main studio album releases in the roster for me to talk about. I know it's going to be hard not to ignore the EPs and compilation albums this band has made, especially given that some of those contain their craziest works, like the 6-hour-long song I Found a Star on the Ground, or an even longer song encased in a freaking human skull. But I'm focusing on studio albums only unless there's specific releases that influence their direction and or account for a major change in their history. So, without further ado, let's tackle this monster, shall we? The Flaming Lips were formed in Oklahoma City in 1983, consisting of Wayne and Mark Coyne on guitar and lead vocals, respectively. There was also Michael Ivins as the bassist and Dave Koska as the drummer. Koska's part in the band was rather short-lived, as he was later replaced with Richard English, and after releasing their self-titled EP in 1984, Mark left the band to get married, leaving his brother Wayne as the new lead vocalist from then on. There are various explanations about the origin of the name of the band, with Wayne, I think, describing at one point a dream he had, or a hallucination during a drug trip, where a spirit or image of Virgin Mary on fire kissed him while he was in the back of his car. You know, with the flaming lips. Anyways, after Mark left and Wayne assumed the role of vocalist, they already had a self-titled EP to their name, but it must have done well for the band in some way, because in 1986, the three-piece of Coyne, English, and Ivins released the debut album of the Flaming Lips titled Here It Is. So as this is the first Flaming Lips album, you'd expect this to have something that at least defines the band early on. something firmly established like a visible identity or a unique sound that carries on throughout the whole discography onwards in some way. Sadly, however, that doesn't really seem to happen to any extent. You could make a stretch and say that the experimentation they did after this album was an early definition, but otherwise this doesn't shake anything up even for its time. Now don't get me wrong, this album is alright. In fact, if you like noisy, lower fidelity rock music, then this is right up your alley. But you can switch this band out for some other alt-rock band from the time, and sorry to say it, but you'd still be safe in saying that this is the Flaming Lips in name only. And before you get all bitchy and whiny with me over, well, they had to start from somewhere, or they needed a solid foundation to build off of, you know. I agree, I do think it's perfectly fine to start out this way, using some tried and true sounds for your debut studio album when your band has just started up. I mean, nobody just starts out experimental, you've got to have your basic marble before you go and sculpt a Lovecraftian nightmare. I wouldn't be shocked if the band didn't know what they wanted to be at this point in time, much less predicted that they would make it as far as they would in the future. However, it still doesn't mean I'm wrong in saying that you can safely take this album out of their discography and really not miss anything. But as I said before, I agree that foundations were needed, and here we see that foundation take shape. Now about the music itself. All of the instruments on this album are performed pretty well, the slight standout being the drums for being performed noticeably a bit better than the other instruments. Wayne is a competent singer here, although he doesn't bring anything really unique with his slightly nasally tone. In fact, this is probably the most organic yet generic you're going to get from this band before they find out how to use keyboards on later albums. There's quite a few noisy and post-punk elements in the tracks, post-punk like in its time. Notably the longest song here, titled Jesus Shooting Heroin, where after the track's title is sung, there's this riff that sounds aggressive and almost like doom metal in a way. The track itself is relatively quiet throughout, but man, that riff is the highlight for sure on this song. And another plus to this is that there's not a lot of stark contrast mood-wise on this album between the slower tracks and the quicker ones. The flow overall is actually fairly steady despite the variation. And yes, I am talking about immersion. That's what's nice about a lot of the Flaming Lips discography. Their albums don't feel like a collection of individual songs with little to no connection between them, like pop albums or just any other rock album out there. They can be listened to individually, of course, but what I mean is you're almost never going to have a disconnect where a track will have a somber, quiet ending, and then at the beginning of the next track there would be a sudden burst of noise or an otherwise drastic shift in tone. It will happen in this discography, which is why I say it almost never happens. Charlie Manson Blues is easily the highlight track of this album besides With You and Jesus Shooting Heroin. This track is just awesome from like beginning to end. It's as if they drew the spooky vibes from early occult psychedelic rock like the debut album of Coven and applied it to their noisy punk rock mix. The riff here is really catchy, and the tone overall gives this creepy Halloween Scooby-Doo party vibe. It's just done very well. Now, although I did criticize this album for being generic and interchangeable, with the sound fairly explored already back then and especially unremarkable today, overall I can say that this album was worth the listen. It's got some memorable moments and it manages to keep my interest in it throughout, but in the context of this discography, it's Flaming Lips in name only, like I said before. But hey, you gotta start from somewhere, and this is where they started, so I can't judge them too harshly for that. So after the band released their debut album, for whatever reason, they went right to work on their next one, released just the year after. Who knows what spark they had in them, but if they went to work 1 year after, then it must have been something. I have no idea if their first album sold well or not, or even if they were anticipating it to sell well, or if they were just recording these albums for the music, man. The band we know today just does things just to do them, it seems, so I don't know, maybe they had the same mindset 30 years ago. And they were a three-piece band at that point, so they were managing more than just guitars, vocals, and drums per person, so in 1 year later, in 1987, they released their second album, one that would truly show us their weird identity in its earliest incarnation.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.
Okay, so if you're a moderately hardcore Flaming Lips fan watching this, you probably got at least a bit irate with me when I said that Here It Is pretty much a non-essential album. And despite my concessions, I'll stand by that when I cover this one, so no apologies here. To non-Flaming Lips fans and or people who want to go through their whole discography, you should go directly to this album first, because I personally would rather consider this one their debut. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this one at least establishes some of the traits in the Flaming Lips' national archive of material that are consistent throughout the rest of their discography for the most part. This album is basically the same thing as Here It Is, except in my opinion it serves as a better, more promising foundation, and to be honest, it's just all around better. Now don't get me wrong, the first album is alright, and I'm going to say that for the last time to get it to stick in your heads, it's a good album. But I think this shows the band in a better light. First, let's address that little baby elephant in the room before it grows to something that I'll have to talk about when their 8th album rears its messed up head. The Flaming Lips throughout all of their albums often have long-ass song titles, and they first appear here on this album with tracks like Maximum Dream for Evil Knievel, or 1 billionth of a millisecond on a Sunday morning. You know, just in case you thought Judas Iscariot was the master at overdoing the simple act of coming up with a song title. Thankfully they don't make this a staple of their releases, but be warned, we are in for some wacko bullpucky. Another point of interest, and also my main reason why I prefer starting here on this album, is just how weird they got here in comparison to their first album. On tracks like Prescription Love and both parts of Ode to CC, they get really into making things as stand out as possible, and at the end of the introductory track titled Everything's Exploding, the song seems to break down and melt, I guess, with everything going crazy and it still actually sounding like a song instead of a Captain Beefheart demo. However, most of the other tracks are either so-so or subpar, including Prescription Love, which I just mentioned as one of the standouts of this album. Past the experimental and interesting moments, it goes into a melody that's really reminiscent of surf rock, and surf rock as a genre is just something I can't stand. Songs like Thanks to You and Can't Stop the Spring are simply bland. Sure, they're alright to passively listen to, but you're not finding anything really catchy or important to the album. Filler isn't a word I'll use often in this retrospective, thankfully, but these tracks definitely do fit in the category. The longest track, and also the longest named on this album, 1 billionth of a millisecond on a Sunday morning, has a great first section to it. It's like prog rock and a ballad type of song. It may be a stretch to say this, but I'd say it sounds a bit like Pink Floyd.
Turns out to be
And that's about it for this album. It's hit or miss. I really have nothing to say about it that I haven't already said about Here It Is, or anything I haven't said in the introduction. It's basically the same album as Here It Is, except better. And I also have no history between now and the next album, so let's see it. Released in 1989, this is the first actual experimental album that the band made. or at least initially. At first they intended this to be a concept album taking the form of a sound collage, but for some reason or another they scrapped that idea in favor of the usual structure they had been recording their albums with. However, it's clearly not a clean cut away from that idea because you still hear the remnants of a sound collage on most of these songs, and to be honest, it isn't always for the better that those remnants remain. For example, going from the wild and crazy track Drug Machine in Heaven to the 30-second interlude Michael Time to Wake Up, you're gonna hear some big contrast between those two. There's also a lot of disconnect between Miracle on 42nd Street and Fryin' Up, which leads me to believe that this actually should have just been a collage because it actually feels like the track listing is out of order. Whatever the case, at least the tracks themselves are satisfactory on their own musically. We're not going to do a track by track because frankly, it's not going to be worth it for the first 3 or 4 albums. It's just not. The 9th track, UFO Story, is really bizarre. It seems to be split into rough thirds, the first third actually being the UFO story, the second being this loud, noisy, everything's happening so fast around me moment where it's just ballistic, and the last third is a piano melody that strikes me as a mix between the theme from the Halloween movie and the theme from the Twilight Zone, except slightly twisted in a way. I don't know, it sounds like something alien related, which fits really well into the song. Now, if you haven't noticed already, I think the first few Flaming Lips studio albums are kind of meh. They don't hold much memorability past some select tracks, and that's why I haven't really been doing a track-by-track review. And this album is really no exception, save for the idea behind it. But I do find this one more preferable than Oh My God and Here It Is. Here, they augmented their style more and more, namely on one aspect that I almost forgot to mention. Wayne tried using a new vocal style for the track Chrome-Plated Suicide, one that was higher in pitch and a bit more shaky, and he's been working on that vocal style ever since, which has its ups and downs, no pun intended, which I will explain as we go along with future albums. So after they released Telepathic Surgery, the band got a slight lineup change and Richard English left the band for currently unexplained reasons and was replaced by Nathan Roberts, while Jonathan Donahue from a band called Mercury Rev joined as a guitarist while that band was starting up. So now they had 4 members, one more than 3. I can count to 3! They also started working with Dave Fridman, another Mercury Rev member who would go on to co-produce every Flaming Lips album from here on, except for one. Before we go on to the next album, let's give a side note to Dave Fridman. He is another example of somebody that people hear in many places, yet they just don't know the name of. He's worked with many notable acts such as MGMT, Tame Impala, Neon Indian, and Mogwai, just to name a few on his resume. Dave has easily been the catalyst for a lot of what the Flaming Lips do as a band. Yeah, Coin and another future member who we'll get to shortly play large roles, but Dave is the guy who helps to see it perfected. I digress. With this lineup change, the band recorded their next album and released it in 1990 titled In a Priest-Driven Ambulance. Now, this is another concept album mainly focused on the topic of Wayne Coyne's fascination with religion, and with 2 additional members and an increasingly experimental turn, the Flaming Lips recorded an album that I personally think is where they start the path on being good, rather than just generic and/or mediocre. Firstly, Donahue's guitar work on this album is really noticeable right off the bat, along with Wayne's own performance and Ivan's bass. They all work off of each other very well. One good example being the track Raining Babies, where in one section they just have some great cohesion between them. The wild freeform pattern they all take on this section is just really interesting to hear. There are a few tracks, however, where it seems like the band is trying to sound like other groups and artists, or simply just trying not to sound like themselves. I mean, I get venturing off and making something unusual that might remind you of another band or artist, but some tracks sound like they'd be on a Michael Jackson Rockwell level of sounding alike. Okay, that was an exaggeration, but still, you get what I mean. On some tracks, like 5 Stop Mother Superior Rain, it sounds like they were going for a mix of slower Rolling Stones, namely Wild Horses, and I also hear the song Rocket Man in there with the twangy guitars in the background. It's a very good song on its own, perhaps one of the best on the album, but it just doesn't sound that original. Also, Wayne is the only guy on this album who has vocal credits, but he does a good job at not sounding like himself on the track Stand in Line. I don't mean there's anything wrong with him, he just sounds different. And I mentioned previously that he had been working on a different vocal style on Telepathic Surgery, but this one sounds off compared to not only his new style, but the one he was doing before that.
Stand in line. The gates, cemetery on Tuesday morning.
There's still the usual energetic, noisy rock tracks here, and those are alright. There isn't anything I can really feature because, well, this era of the band's history isn't really talked about for a reason. At the end of the album, there's a cover of What a Wonderful World, and upon hearing this, I was skeptical. I didn't have the track listing in my sight, so I thought that autoplay went into a similar artist or album. No, this is an actual cover of the Beatles' legendary song. Nah, I'm just kidding. It wasn't the Beatles that made that song, it was Lemmy Kilmister. Anyways, I was a bit suspicious of this song, but for the most part, this album was going well, so I gave it a listen. I mean, the song itself fit the concept of the album, and so far the album had been good, but even so, I didn't think that a band like the Flaming Lips could pull a cover like that off and still have it sound satisfactory.
What a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow are so pretty.
And the track was actually done well, better than I expected even. It's not the best, because half the time it sounds like mellow, nightclub, nostalgic dad rock with a few unnecessary distorted guitar solos. To be honest, they definitely could have done worse. Neil Armstrong would be proud. So overall, I consider this to be the first good Flaming Lips album that isn't just decent, it actually is good. I mean, what else do you want me to say? Oh wow, they were 3 decibels higher this time! After they released Priest-Driven Ambulance, they got signed to Warner Brothers Records. And faster than you can say, ah, fuck, are you kidding me? They got to work on recording their debut album on their new label. Now, this album was finished in the same year as their signing to Warner Brothers, but the release was delayed by a year apparently because the band sampled a bit from the movie Brazil for the track You Have to Be Joking, and the legal stuff to allow that sampling took a long while to get cleared. But it finally released in 1992, and boy do we hear an upgrade in the sound quality. Firstly, the guitar work on the first track is some of the best on this album. It has a title that I will not bother reading out, and in combination with the deep-pitched vocals, it's just a great opening to this album. The songs here afterwards contain riffs that both Wayne and Donahue make memorable. The second track, Hit Me Like You Did the First Time, has a simple, distorted riff, but it's pretty catchy hearing it the first time around. Something tells me I should be annoyed by it because it seems like it should drill into my head in a rough manner, but it actually doesn't. There's more good tracks on here, like Halloween on the Barbary Coast, but the best track overall on this record, without a doubt, is Frogs. Frogs does have one of the more iffy vocal performances by Wayne, but again, the guitar work on this track is simply the best you'll hear so far in their discography. I know I said the first track has the best guitar work on this album. Well, Frogs surpasses that in a major way. The introduction by itself will tell you everything you need to know right from the get-go why this is going to be an excellent track. Okay, now to get to the faults of this album, because yes, this album also has its faults. One being that the song structure and the overall progression just seem to be a little too predictable. On tracks like Hit Me, Frogs, and Ginger Ale Afternoon, it's just mostly generic, moderately fast-paced tempos, like lazy Nickelodeon Tim Allen's Santa Claus Cop Dog rock that plays while preteens high-five and say, "Yeah!" It can be rather irritating after a while if you've had the history I've had with the Nickelodeon's cartoon ads and the no idea how to use the remote. You're the only one in the living room. Your parents are away from the house and it's been hours. You heard them arguing over who's driving back. There's nothing you can do but watch the ads. You want what's on the screen, but your parents won't buy it for you. All your classmates at school said they're getting those. So you decide if you can't have one, then nobody can. Wait, what was I talking about? Also, the slower, acoustically driven songs can be a little too slow for my liking, suffering from the same issue that Telepathic Surgery had, where it feels like most of the transitions between loud and quiet tracks just slap you in the face. I'm not so much one of those immersion people as I am somebody who just likes each song on an album to feel like it belongs in a specific order, and not just gathered up and randomized like some throwaway compilation mess. Oh, and let's not forget that there's the 29-minute long track at the end of this album titled Noise Loop. This is easily... No, scratch that. This is the most pointless thing. So what is Noise Loop? It is a 29-minute track of what you can visualize to be a distorted metronome. I skimmed over it to see if it was an epic, if it built up to anything, like if the band was trolling me or not, because the band does this on future tracks. They have a lot of repetition on some of those. Maybe there's a good song in here? No, it's exactly what the title says it is. It's a noise loop. This raises some questions, which I will list as they come. First, what the fuck? Second, why did they put that on this album? Third, what was the ultimate point? Fourth, did they think anybody was going to listen to 29 minutes of... I get being experimental, and I get making tracks that challenge the listener, and I get the point of pretentious art tracks that don't know that they're pretentious, but this is none of those. This is dumb. Their explanation is that it's a hidden joke track. I say it only serves to inflate this album for them to actually call it an album. It's a 1-hour album in total with this track included, so that means that without Noise Loop, this album would have been 30 minutes or less. So in conclusion to this album, it's good, but I'd say with some argument that it's a bit inferior to Priest-Driven Ambulance, mainly for the faults that this one has. Not to mention the fact that a good chunk of these tracks didn't stick to me even after a couple times listening, but memorable or not, it still sounds alright, and I'd recommend this album as a starting point to anybody wanting to get into the Flaming Lips from their earliest days. So, after they finished recording Hit to Death, both Nathan Roberts and Jonathan Donahue left the band.
He fucking left the band!
No, they didn't leave on bad terms. At least I don't think they did. Donahue left the band to focus on Mercury Rev, the band that both he and David Fridman were both a part of during their time with the Flaming Lips. And Roberts left because, according to Wayne, according to an interview, he preferred the image of being a rock star to actually working in the band. Needless to say, that caused some difficulty when recording this album. On top of Robert's attitude, there was also the fact that the Flaming Lips were feeling somewhat directionless even though they had more money to spend on the album thanks to their record deal. And to be fair, that does seem to show on Hit to Death. They don't really feel as if they have as much direction as they did when they were recording their prior albums. But now that both Donahue and Roberts left the band, the Lips needed new members to fill the gaps, since they certainly couldn't live up to their label's standards as a three-piece again. So as replacements, two men came to the band, Steven Drozd as the new drummer, and Ronald Jones being a new guitarist. These two are some of the most important people in the history of the Flaming Lips. We'll start with Ronald Jones. His influence led them to make two albums that truly launched the band into mainstream success, and evolved their sound into something that really made them unique and stand out among other rock bands at the time. The rest of the band absolutely loved him, let's say that. And Steven Drozd had an arguably larger impact that still goes on to this day. Today, he is considered by fans to be one of the masterminds behind the Lips' unique take on music, as well as a perfect complement to Coin whenever they both get involved on endeavors like the Electric Worms, for instance. His skills as a multi-instrumentalist have influenced the Lips' direction strongly, and that's putting it lightly. So, what? Oh, there's enough? Yeah, let me see that.
You might find it interesting, I don't know if there's something.
Alright, sure. Okay, on a side note, Drozd also has a children's psychedelic music project with Steve Burns from Blue's Clues. Even if I had never heard it, I'd say check it out, because not only does it have the creative mind of Steven Drozd, but it let me see that. It has Steve Burns. The Steve Burns from Blue's Clues, from our childhoods. Assuming my audience is like edgy 19-year-olds. Wow. Thank you, where'd you go? So anyways, these two guys would prove to be a major buff to the Flaming Lips, and they both came at once. That sounded wrong. And with this new lineup, they recorded their 1993 release, Transmissions from the Satellite Heart.
The Transmissions from the Satellite Heart, it came out in 1993, but it wasn't until the end of 1994 where She Don't Use Jelly starts to be played on like Beavis and Butthead and, you know, alternative radio stations and all that sort of stuff. And so I think if, you know, by then we had already been, you know, playing and promoting and going to radio stations and going to MTVs and stuff like that for a little while. And it didn't surprise us that it was working a little bit, but then it always is kind of weird when it starts working better than you think. It's like, oh, that's, they're there. People are really liking this little song.
This is coincidentally the one album I mentioned earlier to not have Dave Fredman playing a role in the production. Why? Who knows, really. But his absence is noticeable right from the first track because the vocals are a bit higher in the mix than usual, and the instruments sound a bit cleaner, especially the drums. This has its pros and cons depending on how you feel about production and music, but to me, it makes like no difference with the Flaming Lips. So the first track, Turn It On, is a good starter, especially at the end with the crazy guitar the band went with here. The second track is an absolute drag. Pilot Candidate the Queer of God? What even is that name? It goes on and on and on with the same tempo and the same structure, and it started to drive me crazy halfway through, even at the moderate length of 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Okay, let's get right into it. The fourth track is probably the thing that most people think of when they think of this album. She Don't Use Jelly was the band's first hit in the US. This track is weird because the lyrics don't seem to make any sense whatsoever. Not that I had expected the lyrics of all things to make sense from a band as all over the place as this one.
She don't use jelly or any of these. She uses Vaseline.
On top of that, it's probably one of the weaker tracks on the album. It's catchy and it's not bad, but I'm confused why this track was the one that got popular. I know pop music fans throughout history have always chosen the worst out of a good thing to like, but come on! You guys had like an album's worth of good material and you had to choose the blandest track here? What were you thinking? Yes, there are other songs here deserving of attention, such as When You're 22 or Slow Nerve Action. I can't find anything else to say about this album. I mean, what else is there to say? They continued on the same direction they had been with Hit to Death. They got 2 new members, they have a breakthrough hit, nothing really else happened. So as I possibly may have said, this album made it big and was the first major breakthrough for the Flaming Lips, mainly due to the success of course, She Don't Use Jelly. It made the band rise quickly, and soon they found themselves on tour very often, opening for bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, for instance, take that as you will, and they were pretty much getting up there in terms of popularity at this point. They were featured on nighttime television talk shows like David Letterman. They had like 5 or 6 groupies or something. It was a good point for the band. Wayne's vocals continued to adjust to the higher pitched tone he tried out on Telepathic, and now that the Flaming Lips were getting big coincidentally at the same time, it's a no-brainer that he continued to use this in the albums afterwards. So if you were starting to miss his nasally krautrock tone from the early days, keep missing it. So after this album was released and She Don't Use Jelly became a charting hit, they were on tour for a good year or so. And in 1995, they made a new album, one that a lot of fans hail as one of their greatest, if not the greatest album they've ever made. Yeah, now we get to more normal release times for the band, this one being 2 years after their last album. You would think that the Flaming Lips would be exhausted after the tour, with no desire to keep recording music for at least another decade, especially after being popular in the 90s of all time periods. You would think that they'd take a hiatus or something, but no, they didn't. They had 6 albums before this, and they had been on a rather rapid pace since 1983. At this point in their discography, it's 1995, and they have not had one hiatus at all. That proved to be a problem later on. Okay, now about the album itself, I can see exactly why this is regarded to be one of their best of all time. Because it is. I knew this by the time I finished the 6th track, and when I finished the album, I was entirely on board with the idea. Each track is done just shy of superbly, with the additional features of more synth work introduced to complement the instruments, and overall some very unique techniques for their time played out here. And although the vocal melodies follow a cheery/moody pattern, the instruments have enough variety and sheer scale to make those melodies sound great. I can name any track that accomplishes this, like Brainville, Lightning Strikes the Postman, They Punctured the Yoke. Pretty much all the tracks here fit that bill. There is no filler or dull moment, everything flows well, and before I knew it, this album was over. It's 47 minutes long, but it felt like 20. When an album feels shorter than it actually is, I tend to take that as a sign to say, wow, that album was good, because really, nobody likes an album that feels longer than it actually is. Lightning Strikes the Postman has to be one of my favorite songs off the album. Psychiatric Explorations of the Fetus with Needles, and yes, that is a track name, bear with me, is probably the closest track you'll get to prior albums. And take that as you will, because most of the tracks here follow a slower tempo than the Disney Sunny Rock I mentioned before. But even as this is one of the more classic sounding songs, the melody on this one is just too good to pass. There's a rather unique blend of synthesizers with instruments on most of these tracks, while still keeping much of the natural, organic sound of the band alive as possible. The presence of synth overall in this album is about the same amount as you would find on most amateur psychedelic rock albums, with more preference being given to the instruments themselves. The last song on the album, titled Bad Days, is for one notable for being played in the Joel Schumacher film Batman Forever. A film that really didn't deserve the Flaming Lips name on it, let's be honest. The song sounds a bit more wonky and playful in its melody, apparent by the addition of what sounds like xylophones, which I think is pretty cool. When an instrument like the xylophone is used correctly, it can be really supportive to a song overall, regardless of the genre. So, although Clouds Taste Metallic is regarded to be one of the Flaming Lips' best albums, possibly regarded by fans to be even better than Satellite Heart, the album wasn't as much of a commercial success as the previous one, probably because it wasn't pop enough. But it got high ratings nonetheless, and warranted a year-long tour afterwards, at the end of which the guitarist Ronald Jones left the band. Remember how I said that their last year-long tour proved to be their undoing in some ways? Well, this is where that took effect. There's not necessarily a clear-cut reason why he left, but he surely didn't leave for no reason. Some said he had a bad case of agoraphobia, and a documentary on the Flaming Lips implied that he left because of Steven Draw's drug use. I'm more inclined to believe it was on Draw's part, due to the fact of that source being, well, a documentary, and also due to later events which we'll get to soon. Whatever the reason, Ronald Jones had left the band. And this was a major blow, because it was Ronald Jones who had been with the band through two of their best albums, critically speaking, and it was he who had influenced their musical direction, which led them to that point. They became a three-piece yet again, at least in band lineup terms, except this time with Drawsd remaining alongside Wayne and Michael Ivins. Around this time, the band was also becoming tired of just being another alt-rock band in the 90s. True, they had experimentation, they had unique sounds and success to their name, and of course they had a record deal with Warner Brothers Records. Who would give that up? But yet they were still tired of the current route that they were taking musically. So they got to work on changing things up and setting a new direction for where their music would go. And this is a large change, one that would affect the Flaming Lips' career and their sound from here until their next evolution. This album, released in 1997, is the heavily experimental and relatively odd release. Yeah, odd relative to the rest of their discography before this point, Zaireeka. First off, before we begin the transition, let's remember one fact. Steven Drawsd wasn't just a drummer for the band. He was also a multi-instrumentalist with the drums, guitar, and more notably the keyboard as well as the backing vocals. So naturally, because of Ronald's departure, he had more shoes to fill for such an ambitious project as Zaireeka. Now, how ambitious was that project? Well, let's have our buddy Wayne say it for himself.
Our guitarist Ronald Jones, who was one of the, the featured sounds of the group, he was kind of becoming not interested in being in the band anymore. And Steven and I began to do what we just called the parking lot experiments. It was us making, back then, these cassette tapes for our friends, and everybody would show up in their cars, and we'd have these big ensembles playing noise and music and these big compositions. That led to us being so excited about our self-indulgent, weird music we were making, that we wanted to make a record that initially I thought it could be 100 CDs that you play all at one time. And then I was sort of, little by little, talked into it maybe being 20 CDs, which I thought was a horrible compromise. And that would seem to, we talked that down to maybe 10 CDs that you'd play at one time. And Warner Bros. Finally agreed to do 4 CDs that would all be played simultaneously at the same time on different CD systems that had their own speakers and everything, which is utterly absurd.
Okay, so there's quite an amount of information about this album, most of it not being about the album itself, but in the way it was released. I'm going to be on this topic for a good while, so if your popcorn and soda are depleted by now, you better refill it quick in like 3, 2, 1. So this album was released as a 4 CD set, with each CD being a different part of the album that is initially supposed to be synchronized with other parts. Now you might be thinking, well that's just ridiculous. You'd have to either listen to all 4 discs of a 45.5-minute album in a row, as a result spending around like 2, 3, maybe 4 hours listening to this thing in an uninterrupted streak, or buy 4 separate CD sound systems just to hear the full album. And if you pick choice 2, ding, ding, ding. The band's intention was for this album to be heard through 4 CD audio systems. That's right, to fully hear this album, you had to play all 4 CDs at once and make sure everything is synchronized. Insane, I know. And I would be fairly angry too if I bought an album only to find out that I need to buy 3 more CD players just to hear everything. It was so ridiculous that while other music critics and music sites were giving this album good-ish reviews, Jason Josephs from Pitchfork gave this album a 0.0 out of 10, mainly citing the fact that it would take so much money in the end just to listen to this album. And Pitchfork later revisited the album in the years after and gave it a better score, but it's hard not to at least sympathize with the original review's intent, let's be honest. And if you're freaking out about 4 simultaneous CDs being played, just imagine more and you'll have figured out the origins of this idea. I mean, really, what was Wayne thinking? The concerts they did for this album weren't live performances. Instead, they did unconventional methods like the boombox and parking lot experiments, where they played the tapes at the same time at different locations around the concert, or gave people the mixtapes to play in their cars while the band ran around and conducted people to raise or lower the volume on their sound systems. In hindsight, I guess the 4 CD system is kind of genius because you could alter the volume on specific sections while listening, and play the album in a variety of combinations. It might be convoluted compared to your average equalizer, but I think it would offer more options for how you listen to the album. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go to the actual music of this album. And from here on, I recommend you use headphones to listen to this review if you aren't already, because otherwise you wouldn't be properly exposed to everything the following albums could provide after the handful of straightforward ones that we heard. Oh, and no wimpy earbuds either. Real men, women, and non-binaries use cups. The first track here has a bass line that is just pure awesomeness embodied. It's instantly catchy, the drums complement it so well. The rhythm is unpredictable at first, but eventually when the drumming reaches a consistent pattern, it just becomes so enthralling. The backing vocal melodies just give me goosebumps every time I hear it, and that isn't just for this track. The vocals with reverb added, and the synth with reverb added, and the instruments panned in separate locations, sometimes with reverb added, are mixed so well together that I guarantee that you'll feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up more than one time while listening to this. The track 35,000 Feet of Despair has this dark, eerie sound to it, as evidenced by the title. The song is about an airline pilot who kills himself mid-flight. It's easy to be lost in the huge array and variety of sounds on this track, just taking everything in and having time fly by. One small bit is especially haunting where all of the vocals are layered onto each other for one line, taking the full advantage of the surround sound format of this album.
Another moth disintegrates. In the beams of searchlight.
The only track I don't like on this album is How Will We Know, just because of the annoying-ass dog whistle tone present there. The album cover has a warning for those things, but this is the only track where that tone is actually present, and it's a shame. No, it's definitely not a shame that this is the only track that has it. It's a shame because beyond the ear-bleedingly bad tone, there sounds like there could have been a good song to hear. It could have been fully listenable to me, but I just can't sit through it, even if it only is 2.5 minutes. And because I'm such a nice guy, I will not subject you all to it. And that about ends what I have to say about this album. Overall, this is, in my opinion, their best so far in the discography, next to Cloud's Taste Metallic. I mean, there's just so much to hear and there's so much more to talk about, but I really have no words that I can't overuse without spending more time going track by track and that'll take an ungodly amount of time. I suggest that if you're interested in all of this, check the album out yourself. It will definitely be worth the listen, even if you don't like it. However, with other critics at the time of its release, Zaireeka was received, well, it was mixed, let's say that. And the band had supposedly been in danger of being dropped by their label due to less and less commercial success of their albums. But then again, what would you expect for a 90s band with one hit song in the mainstream so far? But perhaps most importantly about this album's release is that they had shown that they could still continue on with their sound without Ronald Jones, the guy who had strongly influenced them for a while. In mid-1999, they released their next project. Recording had technically started right after Zaireeka released because they still had some leftover tracks from that album that were cut, but anyways, they released their next album, another classic in the eyes of many, titled The Soft Bulletin.
We probably were wrongly, overly concerned with seeming like we were a cool, weird rock group. We were working towards things that seemed more emotional and seemed based on the power of the melodies, power of the chord structures and all this drama that we would put in it. And so we're doing some of these tracks on the Soft Bulletin I hear now that are easily a couple of hundred tracks. Placing orchestra pieces and flutes and, viola players and all this stuff, layering vocals that should be done by a 40-piece choir, but it's us going in there and overdubbing one at a time. And all that didn't seem like anything compared to the stuff we were doing to Zaireeka. So we're used to lifting 10,000 pounds, and to just lift 1,000 pounds seemed like nothing.
First off, to understand some of the lyrics on certain tracks, we have to go over some events that happened between Zaireeka and the Soft Bulletin. Those specific events being Wayne Coyne's father dying of cancer, a freak accident where Michael Ivins was trapped in his car after a tire from another car crashed into his windshield, and Steven Drozd almost having his hand amputated due to what he believed to be a spider bite, which really turned out to be a bad abscess from his heroin use. All of these events are covered in some way in the Spider Bite song, but before we get to that, let's do a general summary of this album first. This album is another good release, as I've said earlier. Not as good as Zaireeka, and arguably not as good as Clouds Taste Metallic in my opinion, but that may be in part because the aim of this album was to be more commercial and accessible than Zaireeka, and you can automatically tell that it succeeds in this aim. Then again, it's not really that hard to be more conventional than Zaireeka, let's be real. Either way, it really doesn't matter in the end which album is inferior to which. I'm talking about the Soft Bulletin right now, not Zaireeka. We have a few memorable tracks here on this album, and that's not to say that the tracks in between aren't also good, because they are, but some like Spider Bite Song, Feeling Yourself Disintegrate, and Sleeping on the Roof, they stand out for different reasons, but they are all memorable and different sounding Flaming Lips songs. The Spider Bite song, although admittedly awkward, is based on the events I described earlier, the title stemming from the abscess on Drozd's hand. So before I get into describing this track, let me say first that I have my issues with it. I can make the observation that Coyne is obviously singing about things that are personal, like his reaction to these events. One line suggesting that if their drummer's hand did get amputated after all that, they'd have to break up the band. However, the piano melody for this song sounds like Paradise Summer smoochy love song music with little audible twinkles throughout the track. It just doesn't really fit the imagery described. And the lyrics on their own have to be some of the cheesiest Flaming Lips lyrics you can ever hear to this point, somehow supported in their cheesiness by the melody. Every time I hear this song, I just think it's semi-childish.
To lose your arm would surely upset your brain. I was glad that it didn't destroy you. How sad that would be when you had that accident in your car. That whole thing just really seemed too bizarre.
According to Pitchfork's making of video for this album, Wayne was a little wary about making the track about him, and yeah, I can see where that would be a concern. He isn't necessarily singing about the events themselves occurring, more so his own reaction to them after they've occurred. Feeling Yourself Disintegrate is a nice, calm track, well, relatively calm. The intro is really great to hear on surround sound, almost like ASMR in a way, except not as pointless. And the melody is really clean cut and polished. There's not much else to say, but it's a good song. Sleeping on the roof is probably best experienced when doing exactly that. And in case you guys are tone deaf, I don't mean that in a bad way. It's an ambient instrumental with a bunch of sound effects like crickets, frogs, that type of stuff, except with a piano and synth alongside them to form a melody that all combines into a great ending song for the album. However, this song also has more of a sad, sentimental vibe that I just don't really feel in the rest of the tracks on this album, which is to say this one feels a bit out of place. Race for the Prize is a good upbeat sounding song that has some vibes from the Flaming Lips early 80s days. I especially like how the drums just blend seamlessly between loud and powerful in the intro to collected and calm upon the first few lines. Coin's vocals get somewhat overdone on some tracks to where he sounds very shaky, like early on in A Spoonful Weighs a Ton. You can make the argument that his vocals are shaky in general on this album, but that song is where I noticed it especially. Overall, like I said, this album is a good one in my opinion. About on par, if not slightly inferior to Cloud's Taste Metallic. In the widespread opinion, this is their masterpiece. The album that defined the Flaming Lips best and one of the best albums of the late 90s, period. So yeah, to say the least, it has aged well. The reception was very, very positive at the time too, which meant that the new path that the Flaming Lips were taking was working out for them. However, the new synth-driven direction wasn't quite working when it came to live performances. They had already shown that to some degree with Zaireeka, and making an album with different means again wasn't going to work as a three-piece. So they did more listening experiments at their concerts before hiring a guy named Cliff Scurlock to do drums on this album. Cliff is yet another notable member of this band. His addition was initially to make the live performances easier for the group so that Draws could play guitar, and over a period of time he became an official drummer for the band. Now as for the impact he had, that would be controversial to make a call on because of fan opinions on him during an event that I will go over later near the end of this retrospective. So with the addition of Cliff, the band's technique ended up working again, and they were enjoying a more solid fan base and a new mindset for where the music would go. And when you find a new thing that works and is proven to be successful, well, what do you think you would do? They followed it up with an album? I mean, they were likely going to release another album anyways in like a week, but in 2002, they released Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots.
To us, we were experimenting with pop music. We would listen to things like Nelly Furtado and Madonna, and we would say, why don't we try to do that to our music? Like, wouldn't it be funny if? Not thinking that we're making commercial sounding music, we're thinking we're gonna put this to our simple little funny songs about robots. And wouldn't that be interesting? Even a track like Do You Realize? You know, we would play it up against Timbaland and some of these things, and we would go back and rework the dynamics so it would have this pop intensity to it. I think by the time we got done with it, it didn't seem weird, or it didn't seem pop, or it didn't seem anything. It just seemed like this would be the music that we make.
Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, in many fans' eyes, continued the streak of good albums released by the band, and brought yet another development that would mark their sound even to the present day. The first part of that sentence doesn't apply to me. Yeah, if you listen to the Soft Bulletin and this album back to back, there's a noticeably large difference in sound, and that is a fact, but comparing them back to back and seeing which one is better, that's another story entirely. This album portrays an overall bright mood, but with a darker undertone, as if there's really a battle being shown not just in the title and the cover of this album, but also in the music itself. It's a fight between happy and sad, good and evil. The album doesn't make this too obvious to hear on a first listen, and if you're going through the Flaming Lips albums, judging them from the first time anyways, you deserve to be attacked by pink robots.
Please assume the position.
But this audible battle between the good and evil portions work to a strong advantage in this album. It's something that definitely helps to keep up interest on a full listen. This also continued the increasing use of synthesizers in the band's discography, sometimes expertly blended with the instruments to almost overtaking all of the instruments in the song All We Have Is Now.
We're not gonna make it. He explained how the end will come.
The album cheers up a bit with the title track Part 1. The lyrics are surprisingly not too cheesy, unlike Spider-Bite's song. It comes close to Parmesan level cheesiness with some of the word choice, but it's fine for the most part. Why would robots want to eat humans though?
But you won't let those robots eat me, Yoshimi. They don't believe.
Part 2 of this song, on the other hand, doesn't have a great opening, and even for an instrumental, it's not up to expectations based on everything before this. This section is easily one of the worst things on this album. If I could list positives, they'd be whatever isn't brought down by the synthesizers. Yeah, this time the synths and the special effects tend to harm more than they help on this song. When it's not those drilling into your brain along with the smashing of cymbals, it's the background noise of who I presume to be Yoshimi screaming in your ear. Screeching, reminiscent of Yoko Ono. The rest of the songs are actually mostly just copies of one another now that I think about them some more. Between Ego Tripping at the Gates of Hell and Are You a Hypnotist, I can't really separate those two from each other because they feel like the same song. It's Summertime is a good moment. It's another one of those songs where the Flaming Lips don't really go too loud, but they still deliver a solid listen. One of the least flawed, if not the least flawed song on this album. In other words, one of the best. Then of course there's Do You Realize, another song that this band is popular for, even being featured in a Transformers trailer. But when I hear it, I'll be honest, I don't hear the appeal behind this track, besides being the most conventional song on this track list. I'll admit it's got kind of a catchy chorus, and overall it's decent, but even as it's got a grand scale production, nothing really grabs me or stands out unlike other tracks here.
That everyone you know someday will die.
Now, that song would be great as the end to this album. It's chilling, it serves as a great conclusion. Maybe Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots wouldn't have been such a disappointment that way. However, there's one more instrumental bit that I find to be forgettable for some reason. Approaching Pavanis Mons by Balloon. It's a song. It's just out of place. It's got no particular purpose being at the very end of this album. It could have gone between Are You a Hypnotist and It's Summertime, and there it would have worked better for the flow. Yeah, this album is overrated in my opinion. It's got some good moments, but it's definitely a downturn from Soft Bulletin. Some tracks here I really do like, but for the most part it's just not living up to the standards set on the previous album. And for a band like the Flaming Lips, who pretty much have no standards in general, no expectations because of how diverse their style is, I'm sorry, that's saying something. After the recording of Yoshimi, Steven Draws went through rehab for drug addiction, likely starting it right after the spider bite incident. Since it was obvious the drug use back then and up to this point was causing some discord in the band. After all, it was one of the possible reasons why Ronald Jones left, and that caused this whole shebang to begin with. The band also started collaborating with a larger scope of people, now that they had cemented themselves into the outer parts of the mainstream. They played as the backing band for Beck during his tour for Sea Change, they did a song for the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, a bunch of other smaller appearances like working with the Chemical Brothers and Sonic Youth, and finally, they recorded their 11th studio album, released in 2006. I had some paragraphs to say about this album, but I'm gonna keep this short. Truth be told, this album is forgettable. Here on this one, the Flaming Lips went from a half-and-half mixture of instrumentals and electronics to featuring more guitars and more funk elements. They pull it off competently, but since I don't really have much to say about this album, just assume that that's all they do. I guess the main reason why I don't really care for this one is because I believe the Flaming Lips set the bar too far with their technique to U-turn in their creative process and make a more organic record. There's the orchestral elements and of course the weird moments, but this album just doesn't really capture the feeling that the albums before it did. This is definitely a more mellow project, although it's arguable at best since there's also a good amount of energy. At this album's worst, the tracks get rather annoying, like the Yeah 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 song and Free Radicals. The former for the reasons you'd think it would upon hearing the song title, and the latter for the structure and pacing. I guess let's talk about the Triple Yeah song if I really have to. The only really good parts are the faster, more energetic All Your Power segments, but beyond that, the song gets annoying quick. It's upbeat, but not in the same way Yoshimi was upbeat with most of its tracks. Yoshimi's tone was bright most of the time, but there was something in the music that felt as if the album had a tone of desperation. A tone that it was struggling, sort of like an actual battle. This song, and At War with the Mystics in general, they're upbeat, but they don't give off the same feeling. It's as if there's no consequence to any of it, if that makes any sense. This sounds less like an actual album of music that had work put into it and effort put into it, and more like radio advertising music for air freshener.
Are you tired of the stench of shit burning your nostrils and suffocating you like a chick who's into S&M? Fisting your puss and cheesing the shit out of the hellhole you call a residential? Introducing Shit Be Gone, the newest product that cheap vanilla pieces of shit like you will buy. It features a spray nozzle, spray it at the source, spray it in the light, spray it all fucking day and night, spray it on your toilet paper, spray it on your food, you could even spray it to hide the scent of booze. Fuck it, you could do anything with it. Spray it in your water to punctuate a heavenly taste, like ambrosia and shit lobster. There's no time to waste! Dare not say I told ya. Spray it on your girlfriend so she'll whisper sweet nothings and make you a triple decker. That is if she doesn't ham-fist the sandwich by screwing it up with American cheese and subpar expired lettuce, like an incompetent housewife lush, high on Xanax and cheap wine! Spray it on your other air fresheners to show who's the real fucking boss. Spray it on yourself and carry the power of the immortal blood ritual deity Grimlore. The possibilities are endless because Shit Be Gone is pure freshness. Shit Be Gone, the only way to ward off dismay. Only $6.66. If you order right this instant, we'll up the dose with 2 for the price of 1 and your soul.
I have no idea why the Flaming Lips chose to backpedal a bit on this album. I doubt it was their label's influence that drove the album this way, and I guess they are expanding a bit on what the Soft Bulletin did to an extent, as well as bringing back some moments from Zaireeka, but I don't think it's treading any new ground for the band. Regardless, I still think it's fairly solid despite the lack of memorability and any actual talking points. It's a step backwards to everything I talked about previously on other albums, but it's still something that I wouldn't mind exposing my eardrums to. At the time that Mystics came out, the Flaming Lips were safely planted into mainstream success, and their presence extended outside of the music industry as well. They made a low-budget indie film named Christmas on Mars, with Drozd playing the main character, and of course the band made a soundtrack album to it. They also had a downtown alley in Oklahoma City named after them, and they eventually got their track Do You Realize from Yoshimi accepted as the official rock song of Oklahoma that year. There's some controversy behind that ordeal, but I have no idea why that would be a thing with this band. Sometime after all that happened, they hired a guy named Derek Brown to do guitars and keyboards and backing vocals, so basically another multi-instrumentalist. And then the band recorded and released their next album, which is another checkpoint of evolution in their sound, at least to me, 2009's Embryonic. According to Wayne, according to Wikipedia, this album pretty much sealed the band's direction on the future works from then on. From here, they decided to be much more free-form and much more experimental on every album after this. And come to think of it, that makes the name of this album symbolic. This is the embryo of the new outlook and new attitude the band had on its own work and recording process. The sound on this album would persist in years following as they developed it more and more, thus making this the birth, or the embryo, of their new identity. Or maybe I'm just a pretentious nerd? Either way, this album effectively decided their new path musically, and I can't stress that enough for this album, because Embryonic was possibly more impactful to their career than even the Ronald Jones era was. But enough of my early worship, let's get to the content itself. The first major thing you hear is that this album uses a lot more synth melodies and orchestral elements than they ever used before on any album. Well, before. There's also a lot more noisier rock riffs. On tracks like Convinced of the Hex, everything that I just listed is present and it blends very well together. The second thing is that there's a lot more distortion here overall in the production, mixed with the more delicate synth work. There's not much on this album that goes into full-on noise, but you will definitely note the distortion here, especially if you're listening on surround sound or headphones. Speaking of Convinced of the Hex, the one thing that makes or breaks this album for you would be, well, that track. If you like Convinced of the Hex, it's easy to say that you'll like the rest of this album. Not to say that the rest of the tracks here are too similar, because they aren't, but as I said before, that track blends everything musically and tone-wise you might find on this album. The bass line on the song itself is really, really awesome to me. It's instantly catchy and the melody works off of it, creating this intense atmosphere. To me, it's the perfect opener for this album.
She said, that's the difference between us. That's the difference between us. That's the difference between us. You see, that's the difference.
Okay, skipping through this album for the sake of time constraints, you'll hear some songs that either follow the patterns of those mentioned tracks, or you'll hear some moments that go full-on noisiness, like the song Aquarius Sabotage. Warm Mountain features some instrumental work by another one of my all-time favorite bands, MGMT, who coincidentally also worked with David Fridman at the time when their most successful album got them 3 hits. But I'll be honest, I don't hear anything in this track that would tip me off that MGMT aided with the instrumental work at all. It's not really a collaboration, I mean it's not listed as such, with the featuring MGMT tag in the title, so I shouldn't expect to notice them a whole bunch, but at the same time, you would think that with them helping out and playing some of the instruments and providing backing vocals even, you'd hear something that tips you off. There's just nothing here. Regardless, Warm Mountain is a great song. It's loud, it's got really great pacing, the drum work alone is awesome. In fact, the drum work for this whole album is great, I'll get that out of the way. I will assume that Cliff Skurlock performed it since it is not entirely obvious who did what on this album between Steven and Cliff, but regardless of who did it, it sounds amazing. If you really want to get into this album, I recommend you start with the first track, and I know that sounds funny. But I'm completely honest, Convinced of the Hex is, like I said, the make or break track for this album. It may take a few listens to get used to, but if you end up liking it in the end, you'll end up liking the rest of this album. However, one more thing I have to add is that this one is also less cohesive than all their other releases. By that, I mean that each track doesn't really follow or continue what the last one sets up. It's like a scrambled puzzle of different songs that should go in a specific order, but the track listing is all wrong. They all sound good, but something needed to be changed with their order. So, in case I haven't said it before, this album decided where the Flaming Lips would go for the rest of their discography, and from this album, they proceeded to make a whole cover album of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, with Stardeath and the White Dwarves, a band that Wayne's nephew Dennis is the frontman of, as well as this, person named Peaches. Okay, yeah, sure. I will not cover that album due to lack of knowledge about the original album. They also released several collaborative EPs since Embryonic, with artists like Neon Indian, Lightning Bolt, Prefuse 73, and even Yoko Ono, which, to be honest, I don't find surprising at all given what this band has done already. The group also played with some unusual limited releases, such as the Gummy Song Skull with a flash drive inside, a re-recording of the Soft Bulletin inside another Gummy Skull, a Gummy Fetus with a flash drive in it, the 6-hour song I Found a Star on the Ground, 6 hours, and of course, the 24-hour Song Skull. An honest to Shiva, 24-hour long song in a skull. Needless to say, it was another limited edition release, but I'm not kidding, people. This thing is legitimately 24 hours long. One song, 24 hours. There are different parts of this song that can be split into sections if you want, although no track listing or movement listing exists on this version due to the fact that this is literally called a 24-hour song. The official name for this track is Seven Skies H3. Yeah, make as much sense of that as you want, but I'll call it Seven Skies H3 though, for the sake of being specific, in case somehow, somewhere, there's some other 24-hour Andy Warhol's Sonic Wet Dream out there. They had set up a website that streamed the beast endlessly, but that site has since been 404'd into non-existence. However, a copy of it exists on the Internet Archive. If you really feel like you have the time and patience to listen to it, it's a fairly quick download. And here is where I start to bend the rules for this retrospective like I said I would. No, I'm not going to be reviewing the 24-hour song, no. I say I'm bending the rules because later on in 2014, they released a super condensed version of this monstrosity into a roughly 50-minute release chopped up into individual tracks. I will go over this album because the sound is such a drastic change that undoubtedly had an effect on their future albums, and really this one doesn't get as much recognition as it should, yet I consider this to be a must listen to those who want to get into this band. So, without further ado, let's take a look at technically 2011's Seven Skies H3. So what makes this album so impactful and a must-listen as I said before? Well, let's start with two things. First, this album is much darker and much more bleak in tone than anything the Flaming Lips had done before this point. Even the tracks where there's some inkling of an upbeat or semi-whimsical melody, there's a strong, thick, dark tone overlaying that. It's not an outright depressing album like A Crow Looked at Me, Like Clockwork, or Carnival of Chaos, but it certainly has its moments here where it's like, God, this makes me want to put every application on my phone onto dark mode. Everything from the melodies to the lyrics to even, of course, the gray, colorless album cover of an eye, they all make this EP stand out in their discography immensely. And secondly, most of this album doesn't rely on Coin's nonsense lyrics or on the quirky goofiness or wackiness of the band established prior, most to at least half of this album is comprised of instrumentals. Vocals appear here and there, but for the most part you'll hear chilling synth melodies and real instrumentals that seem raw in some moments that drive the bleakness of this album further in a way. But beyond the technicality, the tracks mostly aim for an atmosphere that you can just get lost in, that you can smoke catnip to and have the trip of your life. I mean, who hasn't smoked catnip? The album flows seamlessly from track to track, although that can be expected from shortening and condensing a song that was 24 hours long. Enough about that for a while. Regardless, it's done to a point where you would at first believe that this was recorded the way it is, not edited at all whatsoever lengthwise. Now as for the songs themselves, I gotta say, even though I've spent a good 20 or more hours of my life possibly listening to this album, to say nothing of listening to some individual tracks on repeat, this one is a mixed bag, and that's coming from someone who obviously loves this album. It's a mixed bag in that the band is now at a point where you hear almost nothing of the old organic Flaming Lips days. This album here, if it's not fully synth with a few guitars and drum patterns, it's at least 85 to 90% electronic. Now that's not entirely a bad thing, because as we know, the Flaming Lips aren't one to be lazy with their synth work. At least not yet. But for those of you who are digging their material up to say Soft Bulletin, this album is gonna be another downward turn. And yes, some tracks are simply repetitive, which can be rapidly annoying given the structure. The introductory track, which is also the title track, will instantly tell you what to expect on this album. When the first guitar note is strummed, you know that this will be a darker, sadder Flaming Lips album right off the bat. And when the main melody of this track comes in, it is unforgettable. When I hear this melody, I know it as the anthem of this album. Everything about it is just a downward slope in mood, as I keep saying. The lyrics are about loss, longing, and being driven insane, and Wayne's voice just nails it on this intro.
I can't shut
Yes, this is a very slow track coming in at about 8.5 minutes, and yes, it is a slow album altogether, but it works very well, good, and it's very enjoyable if you have an attention span that isn't Brody's. When the second track comes on, entitled Meepy Morp, for some reason, we get a more hopeful sounding, but still almost melancholy feel, as I mentioned earlier. Again, if you don't like repetition and don't have the time or patience to truly listen to this album and note every change in sound, that's alright, and you may not like this second track, but this supports the mood of the album overall greatly too. The third track, Battling Voices from Beyond, is powerful. It's one of two noisy moments on this album, and like say for instance Yoshimi Part 2, it actually sounds like what the track title implies. That being said, as good as the track is, it may just be me, but I didn't find that this track had any connection to the two prior ones. It's like a loud orchestral moment out of nowhere on a mostly mellow, post-rocky track listing. Then we get a track that I regard to be the first filler moment here, titled In a Dream. In a Dream just has nothing that I can really showcase as a highlight. It can definitely be worse because, like I said, this album, even though it's a mixed bag, it is a mixed bag of great and mediocre flavored jelly beans. This is the mediocre flavor. The synth melody here is unremarkable, Wayne's voice doesn't sound too inspired, and the whole instrumental for that matter is just kinda bland. We get a few more moments on Requiem, which is this album's most silent track, and on the reprise for Meepy Morp, which doesn't sound like Meepy Morp at all. And then you get a sudden burst of noise when the track Right in My Brain comes on. This is the second noisier portion of the album, and like the last one, this is pretty much what the title describes. This is what you're hearing. A riot. In your brain? In your ears? Who knows? It's just screaming on all sides of your head with heavy, distorted, fast-paced instrumentation and no discernible melody, save for some synth that is noticeably the only thing not distorted here. It seems like the synth too could have been distorted, but I guess that provides some... Okay, you caught me. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Regardless, it's a good track, if you like loud noises and banging. Then we get the second part of the title track, which is an ambient instrumental that somewhat follows the main melody, and it's actually the most enjoyable instrumental portion on this album. It's pulled off very nicely, and it serves as the introduction to the final track, Can't Let It Go, which is the true continuation of the first track on this album, featuring the same melody, but it's been reworked to be more energetic as the song goes along. This song is an excellent finisher to this album. Not only is it also just under 8.5 minutes like the first track was, but it actually feels as if it's finishing an experience. After the original 24-hour Song Skull release, the Flaming Lips released a collaborative EP with Yoko Ono and the Plastic Ono Band. Of course, it was given a limited vinyl release like all of their collaborative EPs at the time, and at this point the band was feeling like doing even more collaborations. And given how frequently they were releasing those EPs, it would seem so. Their record deal with Warner was renewed, and they decided to accumulate some of the tracks from their prior collaborative EPs into a whole album, with some new original additions. Some notable guests were Erykah Badu, who Wayne Coyne had apparently called again and again trying to get her onto a track she initially refused doing. There was also Kesha, who actually called Coyne first and got a spot rather quickly on this album, having shown interest in working with them prior. There was Bon Iver, who, appeared, I guess? I have no idea how he came to be here. I never thought I'd actually mention Bon Iver in this retrospective. There's Tame Impala, who I actually like, and strangely, I can't find any information as to how the Flaming Lips got them on this project. And perhaps most puzzlingly, they got Biz Markie featured here. Yeah, this Biz Markie.
Would you say he's just a friend? Would you say he's just a friend?
I'll get into his part later. But anyways, this is apparently the first album with the title including the word Fwends, indicating a series, the second being a Beatles cover album that I won't be reviewing because, God, I don't want to think about that. Even though this is technically a compilation album of stuff from their previous EPs and with a handful of new songs, I count this one as a release I should talk about because collaboration with artists also affects the band's sound in many ways, as we will see later on. Let's do this. In 2012, the Flaming Lips released Heady Fwends.
You must be upgraded. You must be upgraded.
After much deliberation, I decided not to bring Jeff Goldblum into play here. So here's this clip instead.
What the fuck?
This album is one step further into what territory, as the Flaming Lips decided to not only bring other people on here that would seem like the worst matchups possible for them, but they also decided to make their sound even more distorted and more abrasive than before. Imagine Seven Skies distortion times 1.5, actually going into pure noise territory for a good chunk of these songs. It doesn't rely on noise alone overall, but I don't fucking know. They made a rock album for sure, but please tell me if there's any rock album that remotely sounds like this one. Speaking of noisiness, the first song, 2012, let's talk about this monstrosity. The main riff is this heavily distorted thing panned over to the far left. That on its own sounds annoying on paper, but I think the main feature of this track besides the names tacked onto it is that riff alone.
Well, it's 2012. Think we're going to hell. Put me under your acid spell.
Call me an autistic condom escapee, but something about it is just really catchy and makes me want to jump up and get down. I'm so sorry. I definitely see where people would be put off by this song, but frankly, I don't care. For the featured artists on this, we have Kesha and Biz Markie. Kesha somehow suits this track very well, which surprises me because the Kesha from this period was the definition of thought before thoughts became mainstream. The bouncy beat coupled with the swaggering, confident tone just fits her image. And she does not sound bad at all. Now that's all fine and dandy for Kesha. Now what does Biz Markie sound like? Dude, what the fuck? I swear that's it. That's his whole feature. What? So you mean to tell me that in this crazy world, somebody like Biz Markie can drunkenly barge into the recording studio and get a featured tag, but a popular band like MGMT doesn't get any credits when they actually play an instrument or two? The album then takes a slower turn with the next track featuring Bon Iver. Bon Iver is hit or miss, honestly. I like their music in general, but I can definitely see people being annoyed by it. This song isn't necessarily bad, but more so it just doesn't work. It's mostly because of the types of music that both of these bands create. See, Vernon is more of a quiet indie folk singer that uses reverb to create a cooler, smoother atmosphere. But the main difference between the two is that Bon Iver's music is mainly focused on the vocal performance itself, with fairly minimalistic backing instrumentation, with exception to their latest album. Now take the Flaming Lips, who while still being somewhat vocally driven, still have a much greater scale and scope to their instrumentals, ranging from noisy rock music, to calmer electronic rock blends, to orchestral, to acoustic, and recently in this discography, heavily distorted electronic. Combining these two artists to work on a song is like trying to fit a square through a circled hole. It might fit if you chop something off, but at the end of the day, it's just not a combination meant to be. So what's been chopped off, or should I say, how does this track actually sound? Well, Vernon's been reduced mostly to echoing the main lines outside of the chorus with his better-known vocal style, and possibly doing backing vocals, which seem rather iffy.
We thought we were so smart. We thought
This doesn't sound like a Flaming Lips song, and this definitely doesn't sound like a Bon Iver song. It just simply exists on this album. The next two tracks are kind of boring, including Children of the Moon, which was the Tame Impala feature track. This was the one song on this album that I was eager to hear upon seeing that it was in here, and I was shocked that nobody was hailing and praising the simple presence of both the Flaming Lips and Tame Impala together, but now I know why barely anybody talks about it, because God, is it boring! The whole instrumental is boring, the progression is boring, the vocals are boring. You'd think that with two established psychedelic bands, one of which was rising relatively earlier in their career, and both with creative energy behind them, you'd think that they would produce something not even half as bland and uneventful as this one. If you want to hear it, check it out. I won't play it. Thank Dr. Fuck we get actual energy back into this album with That Ain't My Trip, featuring Jim James from My Morning Jacket. First things first, just listen to that opening riff. Okay, so the production for this song could have definitely needed some tweaking to give everything a bit more power, but even if it doesn't have that, it's awesome. There's not much variation in the sound here, admittedly, but it's awesome. Most of the value in this track just goes on how well they use noise and distortion to drive the loud yet really smooth progression of this track forwards, and it's awesome! Then after that we get a Nick Cave collaboration. It's not good, it goes nowhere, and even though it's a headache, it's not Lulu. Next, the Lightning Bolt collaboration doesn't do that much either. Even though the track has some really nice change-ups in tempo, with one segment showing off the skills of Lightning Bolt's drummer, the Yoko Ono collaboration is different. It's different, fairly good despite the repetition because you can tell that the song isn't necessarily trying to be an actual song. It's just Yoko Ono's weirdness paired with the Flaming Lips weirdness. What else could you ask for, really? The next track is definitely the best one on this album, called Is David Bowie Dying, featuring Neon Indian. It's more of Coin's borderline nonsense lyrics, but dude, the instrumental is what makes this song so good, mainly because of the simple yet powerful guitar riff. Something about it is just so catchy and so well pulled off that even though it seems like the simplest thing to do, it's just so greatly executed. Just listen to the whole song yourself. There's only so much words I can say about how damn beautiful this track is. And the last tracks are forgettable. Enough said there. You know, I used to really like this album due to how weird and off the walls it was, but now it's just really hit or miss for the majority of it, because creatively it seemed the band hit a rock despite working with a number of names. They had a unique sound going here, but thanks to the nature of this release, it just isn't consistent with itself musically or quality-wise. It's an album you can easily skip in final, although yes, this is still somewhat influential. It's not appallingly awful, but I'd be lying if I said I truly enjoyed anything more than maybe 3 or 4 songs. After that album, the Flaming Lips decided to hire another multi-instrumentalist by the name of Jake Ingalls, and they made an album that is widely regarded to be one of the best Flaming Lips albums of all time, and my personal favorite album of theirs out of all of these on the list. If you took Seven Skies' subtle, dark atmosphere of cynicism and sadness, gave it Embryonic special brand of energy, and took the best possible blends of synths and instruments from Yoshimi, and put them into a noisy old blender, what you would find yourself drinking in the aftermath is The Terror. It's dark and moody, although not in the same way as Seven Skies. It's energetic and exciting like Embryonic, but also eerie and sinister in some areas. It's the fully perfected result of blending electronic music with rock music, even better than how it was handled on Yoshimi. What would I even call the genre of this album? Wikipedia seems to have it spot on, but if I were to generalize it, I'd call it something like dark psychedelic. It's got the entrancing rhythms and the drugged up vibe, but it's also got a dark, almost frightening atmosphere layered over it. There's barely any upbeat moment on this album, yet it isn't depressing, similar to Seven Skies. And the moments that aren't borderline dark are odd and even sometimes whimsical, as if this album is trying to immerse you into the mind of someone who's going insane. For example, Look, the Sun is Rising sounds just like what I said. The drumming really helps to cement that too, in combination with the synth and the erratic guitar playing. The second track, Be Free Away, is sort of like this album's Yoshimi moment, where it seems upbeat to an extent but still carrying a good amount of that haunting darkness with it. It accomplishes this combination better than Yoshimi ever did in the context of this album. It's a medium-paced, slow song with a lot of reverb, but the amount of synth work layering on itself provides an entrancing experience. And between this song and the next one holds a transition that I think is notable on its own for just summing up all of the emotions portrayed on this album. The third song, Try to Explain, is the song that captures this album perfectly in my opinion, even better than the title track does. It is the mellowest, saddest song on this album, and yet it still retains that eerie descent into madness feel that this album is so consistent with. From the moody, distorted melody, the little synth effect that repeats throughout this track, rising in pitch, to the semi-gothic orchestral chorus, this track just captures the whole album's bleak tone that Coin described it as. It's also just the right length at over 4.5 minutes. It isn't too short and it isn't too long either. It's perfect, it's the best song on the album. Period. Exclamation point. If there's one critique I can give for this song, and this applies to the whole album, so let's kill two birds with one stone here, it's actually a stance given by quite a few listeners that these tracks would sound better as live performances than they do on this album. I do agree with that stance for a good amount of the songs here, but even then, this album is spectacular enough already as it is. The title track has a sound overall that's like a twisted amalgamation of all the prior Flaming Lips albums, maybe up to Zaireeka. The rest of the tracks here are consistently good, each with their own defining structure, and they all contribute to this album's legendary stature. I'd go over them if I could, but I'm just pushing the limit on this video length. Yet I really want to spend as much time talking about this as I possibly can, because the next albums... Anyway, if there's an album the Flaming Lips truly have done little to no wrong in, it is The Terror. That is why this is one of their highest rated albums among critics and fans alike, and my favorite album of theirs to date. After this, they can't get better. They also released an EP for the soundtrack of that Ender's Game movie, if you remember that, but at least the album was good, and if you want to hear more of The Terror, there's plenty of Terror-esque and more Embryonic-esque moments on that EP that seem like a sort of epilogue to this album. Alright, I can't ignore the inevitable. Okay, I said that they can't get better than The Terror earlier, and that still applies to the present. It's their masterpiece. And honestly, just saying that sets up a bleak outlook on the future. Well, the fact that The Terror would be their greatest album ever made started to become evident in 2014 when the band fired Cliff Skurlock, the drummer who had been with them through 12 years and had been on some of their most successful albums.
You're fired.
There was conflicting stories between Skurlock and the band as to why exactly he was fired, with Cliff saying it had been over his comments on Christina Phelan of the band Pink Pony, who was wearing a Native American headdress in a photo, thus Skurlock called it cultural appropriation. Phelan, however, is a friend of Wayne's, and of course he came to her defense, eventually firing Cliff from the band shortly after the debacle went down. Skurlock had also supposedly written a letter to Pitchfork detailing Coin's alleged verbal abuse towards him during the controversy. Now, Wayne and Steven's take was that it was more than just that incident that caused Cliff's dismissal, with Drozd announcing that they split with him over the usual musical differences that you encounter in many bands. However, Wayne went one step further and stated in an interview with Rolling Stone that Cliff was a quote-unquote pathological liar, and that he wasn't very significant to the band. He also stated Skurlock was in general a bit of a dick, but that's unimportant now. So yeah, the split wasn't that smooth or amiable, and remember when I introduced Cliff in this retrospective and said that his impact on the band would be controversial to say at the very least? Well, the firing of Cliff left some fans in a bit of a jumble as to how they perceived Wayne, and to an extent the rest of the band, especially given the fact that Cliff at this point had been considered a long-time member, and had been present on some of their best stuff, including The Terror. This divide between the fans still continues to this day. Apparently Cliff wasn't too keen on working with other groups and artists depending on who they were, to the point where he'd often have little to no involvement in the making of those albums. So the whole kerfuffle is made even more complex to where it's hard to really know who was where during those years. Okay, enough delay. To replace Skurlock, two more people came to the band, Matt Duckworth and Nicholas Lay, both for percussion and drumming. Yeah, two drummers to replace one drummer. Not counting the fact that Drozd was, and probably still is, capable of doing it, but hey, the more members, the easier it gets, right? Yep, it's time, people. In 2013 to 2015, the band started working with none other than the woman who single-handedly killed twerking, Miley Cyrus.
No, get off it, get off it. Well, some splaining to do.
As she got more confident and more intense about what she wanted to do. You know, like over a weekend, she's like, let's just put it out. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean? You know, because we're still feeling, you know, some of the tracks were going well, but wouldn't it be great if we could reassess them or whatever? And she didn't really feel that same way, you know. I mean, she liked what was happening, and she felt like it represented what we were doing, and she was kind of like, we're going to put it out. And so, you know, it went from feeling like something that was kind of on the way to being finished to something that was in the world, you know. It was just almost automatic.
The band had worked with Miley before on a few projects, such as a cover of the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a song that, in addition to the rest of the cover album, was, in my opinion, an overproduced and overdone release where everybody involved seemed to be trying way too hard. So yeah, let that set the tone for my initial outlook on this album. And before you assume I get on the bandwagon of hating this just to hate it because it's Miley Cyrus and she released bangers, I used to think this album was straight garbage in 3 languages. Garbage, des odieux, spazzatura. And to tell you the truth, even after giving it like 20 listens, I still think it's pretty bad in general as an album. But, and hear me out on this album isn't as bad as I first thought it was. I'm reviewing the Flaming Lips parts in this album only based on what their members are credited on. This is not a Miley Cyrus retrospective suddenly. Stop hitting me. This one had little to no promotion and was released for free on Miley's SoundCloud, so again, maybe the cadre are doing it for the music, man? Like the Lips did and still do with a lot of their material, but intentions aside, the rest of the album is just still mostly God, dude. I know it's not that fun to watch someone bash an album that everybody hates, but I'm giving this as fair of a shot as I can. The Flaming Lips count for like a third to a half of how this album was produced, the other thirds being Miley herself and Mike Will made it. Sometimes there's specific members of the band doing production work, and other times the whole band is credited. Seeing as how this was a group project, I'll just generalize and include the whole band for the most part. The Flaming Lips try so hard to improve the listenability of this thing, but did they really have to reuse parts of their own songs on their previous releases here on this one as samples? So I'm not going to act like sampling some of their previous work in new work is such a taboo thing. Heck, there's a few artists I know that reuse sounds again and again on an album or throughout their work. Lord Huron did it, Ghosty Mane did it, Portugal the Man did it, Code Pandorum used to do it, hell, Deathstep is full of the same snare drums. There's nothing really wrong with reusing stuff you made in the past to make a new work. If it's yours, do what you want. And granted, in the case of the Flaming Lips, when they do reuse their own sounds, it generally turns out fresh here, but at least they did it somewhat subtly in the past. Here, the sampling on this album can be rather lazy in comparison. As I said before, there's good moments on this album, sometimes great moments. In fact, let me rip off Christian McGuire of all people for a little bit, and make a montage of actual good moments on this album that the Flaming Lips were involved with. I wish I could list more, but for the most part, these tracks are bland, underwhelming, and just flat, with legitimately bad moments in relative abundance, and serious flaws in some of the better songs. For example, the simple appearance of Big Sean on one of the tracks, that on its own is a red flag. Wayne and other members of the band have writing credits in addition to production, which is really disappointing to see. They're raunchy sex lyrics, which aren't even cute or funny enough to laugh at. Yeah, the Flaming Lips gave their input here on this whole album, and like I said, they try so hard to do well, but it still doesn't make this album as a whole much better realistically. Yeah, they couldn't get better than The Terror, and any release afterwards may not have been as good, but to go from The Terror to this? That's something else entirely. This is easily the worst album they've been involved in making. That's counting that Beatles cover album I didn't go over. That's counting Heady Fwends. Now, even though fans were divided over Cliff's departure, even though fans split off after the band focused on collaborations and cover albums, and even after fans left when Dead Pets came around, it isn't getting truly bad on the part of the Flaming Lips yet. They had released The Terror a few years prior, so people were wondering what was next for their solo releases. And in a span of 3 or 4 years during which they helped record and produce Dead Pets, they made a new album. An album that was them doing the music. Not Miley, not Biz Markie, them. And in January of 2017, they released it with the title, OCZY MLOdy.
We, for the longest time, still came about it like, you know, I'm a singer, I'm a songwriter, I play guitar, and the drummer plays drums, and the bass player plays bass. But being around Miley and Mike Will, and even for a moment being around ASAP, you know, there's no structure to it. It's just a song, it's just a sound, it's just a track, and then you do stuff to it. And so I think Steven and I began to think maybe we should do that, and we'll be the ones that create the track, and then we would present it to another version of ourselves and say, what do you think of this track? Even though we made it, you know, we would sort of try to play it both ways. We don't want to do the same thing over and over again, or be conscious of it anyway, and you feel like you're doing new things. It's exciting and thrilling, and when it works, you're like, look at that.
So what were people expecting for this album? Well, it's really hard to say. At this point, the band had been working with so many people and making rather polarizing material lately. They were now in league with Miley Cyrus of all people, as I said before, and from the singles released and the 2 videos Wayne uploaded explaining this album, it must have been even more of a jumble as to what exactly this album would be. Firstly, that title. I mean, OCZY MLOdy is pretty out there from the blue, even for this band. And yeah, they knew it was some mispronounced, misspelled, and mistranslated Polish, but damn, was that really going to be their album title? It reminds me of Milo Xyloto, and I still don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. So the singles released and the beginning of the year came, and the Flaming Lips released this new album, and we finally see what the rockers are cooking. Okay, I'll say this, I actually enjoy listening to this album quite a lot, and I think some of the criticism of this album from others is unwarranted, but I do realize how lackluster this album is, and sadly that's a majority of what I have to say about it. For one, it seems like most of the actual instruments are now all but gone. It's like this album is purely electronic and big, bassy MIDI percussions or keyboarding. And anything that isn't any of those have been processed to oblivion, save for some guitars. Apparently in the span of time that this album had been recorded in, the Flaming Lips tried incorporating elements of The Terror, Yoshimi, and according to some people, Soft Bulletin. All of those influences came together in this. An album that mainly has an ambient, minimalistic, dreamy tone, similar to Seven Skies, yet sounds nothing like Seven Skies save for a few structural similarities here and there, if that makes any sense. Now, am I technically right in saying that this album doesn't sound like anything they've ever done before? Of course. And I'm completely right in saying that flat out. This is something new and unheard of from them in their catalog. But here, the Flaming Lips aren't a rock band anymore. Rather, they're a weird mashup of electronic, pop, and orchestral music. That might be justified by the notion that nearly every member does keyboards here, and the ones who don't are either percussionists who use computerized drums anyways, or the one guy who thought,
you know what makes this band a band, and not the new Linkin Park album? A freaking guitar, man!
One downside this album has is its tendency to reuse its own sounds, and yes, I covered this on Dead Pets, so I'm not going to rant about it here, but when you hear them, you do notice them. For the most part, this album is really just forgettable. There's only a handful of songs on this 12-track album that come close to standing out. This sounds more like Animal Collective than anything else. Except Animal Collective has much more energy. This is just flat soda. Unfortunately, this is also where Wayne's vocal style seems to audibly falter, as he starts to sound more dry and gaspy than before. Not to mention most of his parts are complemented by backing vocals all the time, likely to mask the fact that his style is starting to run its course. So why exactly do I enjoy listening to this album if it has this many flaws and negatives to it? Well, maybe it's because at the end of the day that this is still different and unique, and it stays true to the Lips' intention of being all over the place and experimental. They do say they just play around until they find something that works and then work heavily on making that something work. It opens up rather strong with the first two songs, which are the title track and How. Both of these tracks use the same melody, one being more of a warm-up to the next one. These are both really good songs, but if you're like Brody and are allergic to listening to music that isn't in your comfort zone, skip to the ending timestamp. How overall is a decent track that I don't really have much to say about, surprisingly. For the most part, it's mellow and slow with some powerful percussions. One segment that is the only one where the song has some activity is a highlight, I guess. Another characteristic this album seems to depend upon is the ambient synthy orchestras and the sound effects to carry it onwards. Starting with the song There Should Be Unicorns, that one is energetic in its own weird way. Sunrise is another good song, has a guitar somewhere. Nigdy, and Galaxy I Sink are pretty hollow, so I can't call them filler. One Night While Hunting for Witches and Wizards and Fairies to Kill is surprisingly boring. Do Glowy is another instrumental. It's not memorable, but it doesn't suck. Listening to the Frogs with Demon Eyes is probably the most enjoyable ambient synth track here, mostly because it sounds actually free-form like what the band would do, and has the most natural instrumentation present on this album. I like the synth and bass melody with the rainforest atmosphere. I like the section where the track transitions into the orchestral instrumental. The highlight of this track is the ending where there's loud distorted bass with the melody, done much better in execution than on Nigdy Knee. Then you get to The Castle, which is another strong track here. It's loud, it's got some big Yoshimi vibes to it with the same moods going on, and all around it's a great song. Almost Home is an oddity of a track since it starts out like somewhat of a rock song, and then suddenly transitions into an electronic, minimalistic thing. Then at the end there's We a Family, purposely misspelled to be quirky and cute no doubt, with none other than Miley Cyrus on this song. That in itself isn't bad for the most part, but trust me, regardless of what you thought of her on Dead Pets, you will prefer her voice there rather than her voice here. It sounds like a first take that the Flaming Lips kept for the sake of being weird, which is likely what happened now that I think of it. In fact, that seems to be what the Flaming Lips are doing on this album in general. They're being weird not to enhance the music or their image, but just to be weird. You can see this from their videos that I'm showing right now as visuals, and you can hear it from this album as it's playing. It's as if the Terror was their period of dementia or